Robert Duvall was third in line at a feed store in rural Virginia when the man at the counter ordered double portions of everything: 2 bags of seed, 2 salt licks, 2 rolls of fencing wire. The clerk filled the order without a word. Duvall watched the old man load it into his truck alone and drive away, and he stood in the parking lot for a long time after, because he had just understood something about grief that no one had ever said out loud to him before. It was a Thursday morning in April 2009, and the Rappahannock Valley Feed and Supply on Route 211 outside Sperryville, Virginia, was doing the Thursday morning business that feed stores do in April. The ordered, purposeful commerce of people who have things that need feeding and land that needs tending and schedules that the season dictates rather than their own preference. The store smelled of grain and sawdust and the particular dry warmth that animal feed produces when it is stacked in large quantities in a building that has been stacking it for decades. Duvall had come for the usual, a few things for the farm, nothing that required much thought. He took his place in line behind 2 other customers and waited with the patient, unhurried quality of a man who has learned that most waits are simply time that has not yet been assigned a purpose. The man at the counter was in his late 70s. He was not a large man, lean, slightly stooped, with the particular weathered quality of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors in all weathers and has stopped thinking about it. He wore a worn canvas jacket and work boots that had been good once and were still serviceable, and he held a handwritten list in his left hand that he was working through with the focused, methodical attention of someone completing a task that requires accuracy. 2 50-pound bags of sunflower seed, 2 salt licks, 2 rolls of fencing wire, 2 canisters of the mineral supplement. The clerk, a young man in his 20s who had worked the counter long enough to fill orders without looking up, wrote everything down and began pulling items without comment. The other customer in line shifted slightly. No one said anything. Duvall was looking at the list. Not at the list itself. He couldn't see it from where he stood. He was looking at the way the man held it, the way a person holds a list they have written carefully that they consult with more attention than the items themselves require. The list was not long. It did not need that much attention. But the man was giving it the kind of attention you give to something you are not going to lose. At the bottom of the list, barely visible from where Duvall stood, were 2 words written differently from the rest, slightly larger, slightly heavier, that he could not read from this distance, but that had the quality, in their placement at the end of everything else, of something added after the rest was already written. The clerk totaled the order. The man paid, cash, counted out carefully from a worn leather wallet, and began the process of loading his purchases onto the cart the clerk brought around. He did this slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned not to rush things that don't need rushing. He was not struggling exactly, but the pace was the pace of a man doing alone what had, for a very long time, been done with someone beside him. Duvall watched him push the cart toward the door. He watched the door close behind him. He placed his own order. He paid. He carried his things to the truck. The old man's truck was still in the parking lot, a dark green Ford, maybe 15 years old, well maintained in the way that working trucks are maintained by people who depend on them. The man was loading the last of his things into the bed, moving with the unhurried, slightly effortful care of someone doing a physical task that is within his capacity, but no longer easy. Duvall set his own things in his truck and stood for a moment. He had seen something in the feed store that he was still working out, not a mystery exactly, the outline of it was already clear, but something whose full weight had not yet arrived. He had spent 50 years watching people. He knew what it looked like when a person was carrying something that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of difficulty, that existed in the space between loss and the continuation of life after loss. He had seen it in the way the man held the list, in the way he moved through the transaction with the focused care of someone for whom a Thursday morning feed store run had become, without anyone planning it, the structure around which a week was organized. The man finished loading. He closed the tailgate. He stood for a moment with his hand on the truck, not moving, looking at something in the distance or at nothing in particular, with the specific quality of stillness of someone who has completed a task and is in no hurry to begin the next one, because the next one is going home. Duvall walked over. He did not have a plan. He had simply decided, in the 30 seconds between his truck and the green Ford, that walking over was the right thing, and that the plan could arrive after. "Morning," he said. The man turned. He had the careful, assessing look of a man who receives strangers with composure rather than warmth, not unfriendly, simply measured. "Morning," he said. "You've got a good-sized order," Duvall said, in the plain, conversational tone of one man at a feed store making an observation to another man at a feed store. The old man looked at his truck. "Same as always," he said. He said it without particular inflection, a statement of fact that carried, in its plainness, the weight of the word, always. Duvall was quiet for a moment. "You need a hand getting it unloaded when you get home?" he asked. The man looked at him. It was the look of someone deciding something, the specific calculation of a man who has learned, over a long life, to be careful about what he accepts from people he doesn't know, because accepting things creates obligations, and obligations are complicated, and at his age and in his circumstances, complicated is something he has very little patience for. "It's fine," the man said. "I manage." "I know you do," Duvall said. "I'm asking anyway." Something in that, the acknowledgement that he managed, followed by the offer that persisted past the acknowledgement, shifted something in the man's expression. Not much, but enough. "I live out on Route 622, the man said, "about 4 miles. "I know Route 622, Duvall said. His name was George Hallett. He was 78 years old, had farmed his land in Rappahannock County for 53 years, and had been married to his wife Margaret for 49 of them. Margaret had died in February, 8 weeks earlier, of the heart failure that had been announced the previous autumn and that had taken the time it took and arrived when it arrived on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen without drama, which was the way Margaret had always done things. George had continued the farm. This was not, he would have said if anyone had asked, a decision. It was simply what you did. The animals needed feeding, the fences needed tending. The land did not pause because the person who had stood beside you for 49 years was no longer standing there. You got up in the morning, and you did what the morning required, and that was the whole of it. What he had not told anyone, what he had not found the language for, and had not looked for the language for, because looking for language required a kind of attention to the thing itself that he was not ready to give, was that he was still ordering for 2. He had been doing it since the first Thursday after Margaret died, when he had driven to the feed store on Route 211, as he did every Thursday morning, and had placed the order as he always placed it, and had not changed anything, because changing anything required acknowledging something that he was not ready to acknowledge. And then the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, he was not unaware of what he was doing. He was simply not yet ready to do it differently. Duvall followed him out to the farm on Route 622. They unloaded the truck together, which took 20 minutes. George directed and Duvall carried, and neither of them said much beyond what the work required. Where to put things, which way to stack them, the ordinary short language of 2 people doing a physical task together. The farm was well kept, the kind of well kept that comes from decades of consistent attention rather than occasional intensive effort. The barn was clean. The fences were sound. When they were done, George set his hands on the tailgate and looked at the empty truck bed. "Coffee," he said. It was not quite an offer and not quite a question. It was the word he used when he was inviting someone into the kitchen, which was the way he invited people into the kitchen. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee that George made the way he had always made it, strong, in the same pot, in the same cups, and they talked about the farm and the April weather and the specific challenges of the fencing on the east side that George had been meaning to address since autumn and had not yet gotten to. Duvall did not mention Margaret. He did not need to. Her presence was in the kitchen in the specific way that a person's presence persists in the rooms they inhabited for decades, in the arrangement of the cups, in the dish towel folded precisely over the oven handle, in the 2 placemats on the table that George had not removed and apparently had not thought about removing. He noticed all of it and said none of it. At 11 o'clock, Duvall stood. He shook George's hand. He drove home on Route 622. He came back the following Thursday. He did not call ahead. He simply arrived at the feed store at the same time, took his place in line, and followed George's truck back to Route 622 afterward. George received this as he received most things, with composure rather than comment. He made coffee. They unloaded the truck. They sat at the kitchen table. This continued for 6 weeks. On the 6th Thursday, George placed his order at the feed store counter, 2 bags of seed, 2 salt licks, 2 rolls of fencing wire, and then stopped. He looked at his list. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed something out. He looked at the list for a moment longer. Then he said to the clerk, "One of the seed bags, 1 salt lick." He paused. "The wire the same." The clerk adjusted the order without comment. Duvall was behind him in line. He did not say anything. He did not look at George with the expression of someone who has witnessed a significant moment and wants the other person to know it has been witnessed. He looked at the counter and waited his turn. They drove out to Route 622 and unloaded the truck and drank coffee at the kitchen table and talked about the fencing on the east side, which George had finally gotten to last week, and which had turned out to be in better shape than he had feared. At 11 o'clock, Duvall stood to leave. George Hallett looked at him from across the kitchen table, the look of a man who has something to say and has not yet found the right form for it. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, in the way of someone stating a fact they are confident of. "Margaret, she would have liked you." Duvall looked at him. "I know," he said. "I can tell." He drove home. George Hallett died in the spring of 2016 at 85 in the same house in the same kitchen where he had drunk coffee every morning for 53 years. His daughter Claire drove up from Richmond to settle the estate, and in the process of going through the house, she found, in the drawer of the kitchen desk where her father kept the things he wanted to keep, a folded piece of paper. On it, in her father's handwriting, were 2 words. She recognized them as the words at the bottom of her father's feed store list, the list he had carried every Thursday for years that she had seen in his hand a dozen times without reading it closely enough to see what he had written at the bottom. The 2 words were, "And Margaret." Claire Hallett sat at her father's kitchen table for a long time. She still has the list. She keeps it in the drawer of her own kitchen desk, in Richmond, in the place where she puts the things she wants to keep. She has told the story twice, once to her husband, once to her daughter, who is 8 years old and did not fully understand it, but who listened with the complete, serious attention that children bring to things they understand are important. She told her daughter that her grandfather had ordered double of everything for months after her grandmother died, because some habits are so deeply made that even grief cannot unmake them immediately, and that this was not sad exactly, or not only sad, but was also a kind of love, the kind that continues past the point where it is required to continue. Her daughter thought about this for a moment. "Did the man figure it out?" she asked. "The man who helped him?" "Yes," Claire said. "Did he say anything?" "No," Claire said. "He just came back the following Thursday." If this story reached something in you, if you have ever loved someone so completely that the habit of them outlasted their presence, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. More stories about who Robert Duvall really was in the quiet mornings when nobody was watching are coming every single week.